leads me, I will follow on. Down in the valley or upon the mountain steep, close beside the Savior would my soul ever keep. He will lead me safely in the path that he has trod, up to where they gather on the hills of God. Follow, follow, I will follow Jesus. Anywhere, everywhere, I will follow on. Follow, follow, I will follow Jesus. Everywhere he leads me, I will follow on. 188, where he leads, I'll follow. 188. Sweet are the promises, kind is the word, dearer far than any message man ever heard. Pure was the mind of Christ, sinless I see. He the great example is and pattern for me. Where he leads, I'll follow. Follow all the way. Where he leads, I'll follow. Follow Jesus every day. Sweet is the tender love Jesus has shown, sweeter far than any love mortals have known. Kind to the erring one, faithful is he. He the great example is and pattern for me. Where he leads, I'll follow. Follow all the way. Where he leads, I'll follow. Follow Jesus every day. Listen to his loving words, come unto me. Weary, heavy laden, there is sweet rest for thee. Trust in his promises, faithful and sure. Lean upon the Savior, and my soul is secure. Where he leads, I'll follow. Follow all the way. Where he leads, I'll follow. Follow Jesus every day. Mike, Mark. 607. Leroy, would you list word prayer, please?
Yes. Lord in heaven, I thank you again for this time. I thank you for all the many blessings we have in our lives that make it possible to live here in this land. I ask you to be with Wade tonight as he brings forth. I ask you to, once again, to be with the sick and afflicted. I ask you to comfort them, if it be your will. I ask this in the blessed name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen. By the way. Well, good evening, everybody. The cloud is great, except when things don't update like they're supposed to. So, but thankfully, Logan got us all ready to go. So tonight's lesson is from 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon's going to ask God for wisdom. Last week we talked about Solomon becoming king, and as you might recall from that story, Adonijah, when his father David was elderly and death was not too far away, Adonijah tried to seize the throne. David, though, is reminded by Bathsheba and Nathan of his promise that Solomon would be his successor. So David makes sure that that happens. David frees Solomon from any promise that he has made, and we actually see Solomon carrying that out in 1 Kings chapter 2. And I was thinking about this a little bit after the lesson last week, and one of the things I think we can take away from this portion of the scriptures is we begin to see the weaknesses of an earthly kingdom. That when God's people are bound up in an earthly kingdom is going to operate in certain ways. For example, politics is going to be a part of it, unfortunately, because human nature is what it is. And I think that one of the reasons why God has included some of these sordid details, like Solomon executing Joab, for example. I think one of the reasons why is God wants us to see that an earthly kingdom, even when it is governed by a covenant from Him, is inherently weak, that there are weaknesses to it. And I think that the implied message, at least for me, is God has given us a spiritual kingdom in Jesus Christ, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, that has no earthly capital, nor no earthly headquarters, and therefore it's much different. As Jesus said to Pilate, my servants would come and fight for me if my kingdom was of this world, right? So it's by definition a different type of kingdom. That's what we see happening in the Old Testament, is the inherent weaknesses of an earthly kingdom, and I think this is just one example. After David's death, Solomon secures the throne quickly. He establishes himself as king far more quickly than either his predecessor David, his father David, or David's predecessor Saul. Both of them had a rocky beginning to their reigns, but Solomon quite quickly establishes himself as the king of the entire nation. There's very little controversy, and he's able to establish himself quite quickly. Now, one thing I want to do, we only have a chapter to cover tonight, so I want to just take a moment to gain a little bit of perspective. So we're going to zoom out and think back to what we've been talking about really the last few months. So remember, we're in a period of what I'm going to call Reformation. And this begins because of what we see happening in the book of Judges. You might remember a few weeks ago we talked about how in the era of the Judges, the priesthood and the tabernacle basically disappear from the written record. We have a couple of references to the tabernacle at the end of the book of Judges, but by and large, the priesthood and the tabernacle completely disappear from the written record for a period of 4 centuries. In fact, the book of Judges in chapter 21, verse 25, talks about how this era was characterized. There was no king, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes, which kind of implies that there was no central authority. Remember, the central authority of the children of Israel was to be the tabernacle and the priesthood, but it kind of seems like they vanish off the scene. And the reason why is because of what we see happening in the days of Eli. And I don't know that this was going on the entire time of the era of the Judges, but by the time we get to Eli, we see that the priesthood, at least his sons, have corrupted the priesthood. They've caused the tabernacle to fall into disrepute, and the priesthood is revoked from Eli and his household as a consequence for this. All right, so as the era of the Judges is drawing to a close, you see the tabernacle and the priesthood sort of in shambles. It has fallen completely away from what God had in mind under the old law. It's not what it's supposed to be. So he sends this man, Samuel, in an era when the ark is separated from the tabernacle. They're no longer in the same place. The ark is in Jerusalem. The tabernacle moves, well, the ark actually goes several different places, right? It ends up in Jerusalem finally. And the tabernacle sort of wanders from place to place to place for a time period. And it's Samuel who begins a time of reformation, we might even say restoration. He begins to kick this off. And one of the things that makes Samuel unusual, And this has some bearing on the story tonight, is in the time of Samuel, we see people worshiping God apart from the tabernacle. Now, why would that be? Well, because remember, the Ark of the Covenant in the days of Samuel has been separated from the tabernacle. And what is the Ark of the Covenant? Well, that's where the presence of God dwells. So if the presence of God isn't in the tabernacle, then you could say that the tabernacle has lost a part of its purpose, right? Because the purpose was to provide a place for people to worship God. So you see this development happening in the days of Samuel where people are actually worshiping God apart from the tabernacle at these locations that are called the high places. Basically, high hills or mountaintops, people would build altars. In fact, in Exodus chapter 20, verses 22 through 25 and 26. 26, sorry. This is really small on my screen. Moses actually regulates the building of altars. You could build an altar to God, but it had to be of stone, and you could not use any sort of tool to shape it. So he says, if you're going to build an altar, build it this way. And that seems to be what Samuel does. In 1 Samuel chapter 7, verse 17, Samuel made his home in Ramah. He judged Israel from Ramah, and it's also there that he built an altar to the Lord here at Ramah. Remember, the ark is separated from the tabernacle. Samuel decides he's going to worship God here at his home in Ramah. And in fact, when Saul is looking for the animals that have escaped him, he runs into Samuel on Samuel's way up to the high place at Ramah. He was going up there to offer a burnt offering. Now, it looks like to me that this was not something that God really had in mind under the old law. God wanted his people to worship him in the place where he had set his name. In fact, he says this explicitly in Deuteronomy chapter 12. He says in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 13 and 14, "Take heed to yourself that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every place that you see, but in the place which the Lord chooses, in one of your tribes. There you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you." All right, so here we've got this situation. The tabernacle, the priesthood have fallen into disrepute. This ark is separated from the tabernacle. So what is Samuel doing? Well, Samuel, I think, is just doing the best with the situation that he is handed. But what this tells us is the objective is for one centralized location for worship. That's what needs to be restored. And that's what we're building toward in the reigns of David and Solomon. We're building toward this idea of having the Ark of the Covenant in the house of God, one centralized location for worship as God had envisioned in the Old Covenant. And that's what we're working toward. That's what David envisioned in 1 Chronicles chapter 13, verse number 3. He says, let's get the ark back here to Jerusalem. We haven't been using it like we should have since the days of Saul. Remember, the presence of God dwelt at the Ark of the Covenant. And this afforded the children of Israel the opportunity to communicate with God. So David's like, let's get the Ark to Jerusalem. And then eventually, what does David want to do a few chapters later? Not only does he want the Ark in Jerusalem, but he's dwelling in a house. He wants God to have a house in Jerusalem. I want to build a temple for God. We've talked about why David was refused that honor. He was a man of war. God wanted the temple built by a man of peace. So God tells David, it's not going to be you who builds this temple, but it will be your son. Why is this necessary? Well, because things have fallen apart. So David and Solomon are working toward bringing all of these elements back together, where you've got the priesthood, the house of God, the Ark of the Covenant, all in one place, where there's one centralized location for worship. And David, toward the end of his reign, begins working towards this. In 1 Chronicles chapter 22, verses 6 through 8, David says to himself, Solomon my son is young and inexperienced, And the house to be built for the Lord must be exceedingly magnificent, famous, and glorious throughout all the countries. I will now make preparation for it. So David made abundant preparations before his death, and he called for his son Solomon and charged him to build a house for the Lord God of Israel. So David begins acquiring materials. He starts making plans. He organizes the priesthood. He organizes the worship that would happen in the temple. He comes up with all the plans. He gets everything set up so that Solomon could execute this. He would be the one who would build it, and he would build it according to the specifications of his father, David. Now, there's one more thing that needs to be resolved. You might remember from last week we talked about how there were two high priests at the same time. There was Abiathar, who was from the house of Eli, and there was Zadok, who was from the house of Eleazar. And remember, one of the consequences for Eli's son's sins was the priesthood would be removed from his household. And that happens in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 27. And I see this just as another step. Things have fallen apart. David is starting to put them, Samuel started putting them back together. David has started putting them back together. Solomon is continuing that work, and part of that work is, all right, let's get Abiathar out of the way because Eli's house is not supposed to be in the priesthood anymore, and let's get the right guy in that position. That's where Zadok comes in and takes Abiathar's place. So it's important for us to remember that we're kind of building toward this very important moment in Israel's history. Things aren't what they should be, but you've got people who have intentions to make them what somewhat of what God had in mind. Although you could argue that it was always God's intention for his house of worship to be in the tabernacle. And I will just point out, you're going through the book of Hebrews right now. In a few chapters, you're going to begin talking about the tabernacle. And it's just a little reminder that in the book of Hebrews, the temple is never brought up. It's always the tabernacle. And I think there's an implication there. The implication is that was God's original design, right? That's what Moses saw on the mountaintop. And God told him, build this thing according to my specifications, just as I showed you up on the mountain. That was kind of God's, I believe, his OG, right? His OG place of worship. But he permitted David to make these plans and for Solomon to build this temple because things had fallen apart. So I think God made allowances. That's at least my take. So that's kind of where we're at in history. We're working toward a restoration and a reformation that is sorely needed. Things aren't what they're supposed to be. And you have various men working toward that end. Any questions or comments? Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah, Chad, go ahead.
So during the roughly 400 years when there was no king in Israel and everyone did as they thought was right,
yeah.
And you said you took that to mean no central authority, which I would agree with.
Mm-hmm.
So without a central authority, does that mean there was also no laws and therefore no law enforcement?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, and it's interesting because what we see in the book of Judges is a lot of inconsistency, right? You see some things, or in that era, some things are being honored and others aren't. So we know that the tabernacle and the priesthood existed during that time, but it kind of seems to me like they lost their proper place. I mean, that was supposed to be the centralized authority that God gave them in the Old Covenant. Was the priesthood and the tabernacle. That was the organizing authority, you might say. But for whatever reason, and again, we can only speculate, that just had fallen off the scene for whatever reason. And the only real sense we have is that by the time you get to Samuel, things are kind of a mess. And those things don't tend to happen overnight. So yeah, I think that comment, there was no king in Israel, every man did what was right in his own eyes, is sort of a commentary on the time. It's like the tribes were just kind of going their own way. And so there's this wild inconsistency as to, following the law, for example. I think some tribes did a better job than others, would be my guess. The tribe of Dan, for example, got into idolatry pretty quickly, as opposed to some of the other tribes which seem to hold closer to the law. So yeah, but again, we just don't have enough information to flesh that out as much as I would like. But yeah, that's the way I take that statement. Good question. Other questions? Yeah, Darrell, go ahead.
So, you mentioned the kings, and you mentioned that things went, awry here. And we know the law was a schoolmaster to bring us up to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So then it made me think when that then God didn't plan for kings. They wanted kings because everybody else had kings.
Mm-hmm.
But that almost was a schoolmaster for us too, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Because the Old Testament is the schoolmaster. So we see what happens when man does that. And what you just said is,
Exactly.
it was the priest. I'm teaching Hebrews 5.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So then there's your king.
Yep.
So all of that was for our learning and for them to look and say, look what happens when man becomes the king.
Yes.
And that's tied to religion.
Mm-hmm.
Because we see still today that there's royalty that says they're ordained, there's kingdoms that they believe are still, ordained by God.
Yeah.
And so that you can see why.
Yeah.
Because that's the way it was here.
Yeah. King Charles was crowned
Yeah.
in Westminster Abbey
Yeah.
by the Archbishop of the
Yeah.
Anglican Church.
Yeah.
And there's a whole program of things that are supposed to be said and rituals that are all very tightly knit together with religious tradition that goes back hundreds of years.
Mhm.
So, even though England is largely a secularized nation, that's still what that ceremony represents, right? Crowned by God, that old idea that the king has been crowned by God, that goes clear back to Charlemagne.
I was gonna say
When the Pope put his,
Pope King, or crowned the French king.
exactly right, yeah. That's when that became more and more prevalent in Western Europe from that point forward, right? Bishops were.
And actually,
Go ahead.
the Russian czars were crowned by the Russian Orthodox Church.
Absolutely, yeah. That whole thing just started to spread, right? And I think I may be forgetting. I can't remember if bishops were crowning kings prior to that point, but Charlemagne's kind of the big one, right? That's kind of the big example because that's the creation of the Holy Roman Empire and all that. So, yeah.
And the scriptures don't say we shouldn't have governments, and we should have those. But it seems to me like the downfall that that's what I'm getting from anyway, is the way they tied it together then, and they got away from the priesthood, and they went to, secular kings
Mhm.
having the power,
Mhm.
which they asked for,
Right.
which led
Right.
to all kinds of problems, as you
Sure.
said. That's what we've been looking at.
Sure, yeah, absolutely, yeah. And it's a bit of a conundrum because you see God making allowances for things that he did not reveal in the old law all throughout the Old Testament. And you think, why is he doing that?
Yeah.
Well, I think that what you're touching on is the reason why. Is because he's saying, all right, here's what happens when you go down this road. Just kind of follow this along and you'll see why it's a bad idea for you to follow your own ideas rather than following my word. Just simply be guided by my word. Had they just been guided by the five books of Moses, if that had been their guide and they had just stuck to that, Israel would have turned out very differently. But
you just said the tabernacle, not
Yeah.
temple.
exactly, yeah.
So we look at us today,
Mhm.
and we gotta, it's too simple. We gotta do more,
Yeah,
and that's what they were doing.
Yeah.
Because all the other people did it.
yeah. It was David's idea, but God allowed it.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, all right, David, we'll go with this. And then after the Babylonian captivity, he sends that first wave of Jews back to build a second temple. So I'm not suggesting that this was done against God's will. I'm just saying it wasn't a part of the original plan, and God made allowances for that. Go ahead, Priscilla, jump in here.
It is interesting because he warned them about kings. They wanted kings, and he said, it's going to be trouble, you're going to regret it.
Yep.
But back when Jacob is blessing the sons, you know the king, Jesus the king, is going to come through David the king, which means there has to be a king. So
Exactly right.
God, I mean, he was already planning for David.
Yeah.
It wasn't just the people wanted. I mean, they
Good
did
point.
want it, and their heart was wrong, because the reason they wanted it was because they wanted to be like everyone else. But even that before he brought them into the land, he knew he'd set up David, and he knew that Jesus would come through David, because he said the scepter will be through the house of Judah, you know? So it's just interesting how God, it was part of the plan, but it's like he can kind of weave everything together, like the bad choices that the people were making and the bad motivations with his purposes, you know?
Great point. Yeah, very good. Jordan, go ahead.
And when that verse that was just referenced, when there was no king, each person did what was right in their own eyes. Well, originally, God was basically saying, well, you should have a king. And now if they don't have a king, they go back the other way.
Yeah.
So it's like either way, God makes it work.
Exactly right. Yeah, great point. Great point. God makes it work in either case. Yeah. Very good. Other questions or comments? All right. Good discussion there. Well, let's jump into the text tonight, lest I not get to it, which I'm notorious for doing. So the third chapter begins. Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. Then he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the people sacrificed at the high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places. So now you can kind of see why it took just a couple minutes to talk about that concept. All right, this chapter begins with Solomon going back to Egypt. So he marries an Egyptian, the daughter of Pharaoh. And again, this I think just shows us the weaknesses of earthly kingdoms. These sorts of marriages were very typical in the ancient world, right? A marriage between rival nations ensured that those nations would be at peace with one another. That's why the French and the English, intermarried with one another all those years, right? Because they were rivals. And the thought was, if we're connected by blood, then maybe we can sort of keep from fighting one another and be at peace with one another. And that's why all the houses of Europe all intermarried with one another. That, the whole idea of the whole, royal blood and all that kind of weird stuff. But anyways, part of it was a practical attempt to just keep the peace between rival nations. And that's what Solomon's doing here. It's a political move. And it just reminded me of what is said, what the warning that God gives about kings in Deuteronomy chapter 17. Now there's several verses here, but I want to zero in on verse 16. But he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Now, here the warning is to the king, don't go down to Egypt and rely on Egypt for accruing military power, right? Horses were a way to project military might. And that was Egypt was one place where they could get horses. But I think nestled in the middle of this is sort of a warning. Don't go back to Egypt. Don't return to Egypt. This is the nation out of which you came from slavery. And in fact, in Isaiah's day, there were criticisms of the kings in Isaiah's day who formed alliances with Egypt. And if you want an example of that, look at Isaiah chapter 30, verses 1 through 5. So even though this was done for political reasons, and you can make the argument that this was a very practical move on Solomon's part, I think this does give us some indication that the beginning of Solomon's reign wasn't going a direction that was ultimately going to please God. And it's a bit of foreshadowing for what takes place later on. Now Solomon ends up going up to this place called Gibeon. At Gibeon, remember the Ark and the Tabernacle, they've been separated for decades. And as that text alludes, the people have resorted to worshiping God at various high places. We see that back starting with Samuel. That tradition has continued through the reigns of Saul and David and into the early days of Solomon. So Gibeon is a very special high place. That's what the text says. Now the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. This is in verse 4. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. This is one of those occasions where 2 Chronicles actually kind of helps us understand a little bit more to the story. If all we had was 1 Kings, that would be enough to understand what's going on. But this doesn't really give us the full picture of why Gibeon was a special high place. We learn that from the narrative over in 2 Chronicles. So why is Gibeon the great high place? Well, in 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verses 3 through 6, so this is the parallel account of the same story. Then Solomon and all the assembly with him went to the high place that was at Gibeon, for the tabernacle of meeting with God was there, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, had made in the wilderness. But David had brought the ark of God from Kirjath-jearim to the place David had prepared for it, for he had pitched a tent for it at Jerusalem. Now the bronze altar that Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, had made, he put before the tabernacle of the Lord. Solomon and the assembly sought him there. And Solomon went up there to the bronze altar before the Lord, which was at the tabernacle of meeting, and offered 1,000 burnt offerings on it. So why did he go to Gibeon? Well, because Gibeon is the final resting place of the tabernacle. This is the same tabernacle that Moses and the children of Israel built in the wilderness. And as the text notes, the Ark of the Covenant is not there. And one of the other interesting elements that 2 Chronicles includes that we don't find in 1 Kings, it's not just Solomon who goes to Gibeon. He takes a lot of the people with him. So this is almost kind of like a national sort of moment. Solomon's going to Gibeon. A bunch of the Israelites go there with him. He offers 1,000 burnt offerings. We find that out in 1 Kings. But in 2 Chronicles, we find out that he offers that on the altar of burnt offering. That's the one that Moses and the children of Israel built in the wilderness. So that makes this kind of a special moment. And this, I think, is another one of those steps toward restoring things back to their proper place. Solomon leading the people to the tabernacle in Gibeon represents another step toward restoration. We're going to make things back the way they used to be. And I think this just represents another step in that direction. All right, so we keep on here in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 5 through 9. So they're at Gibeon. They offer all these offerings. The Lord appears to Solomon in a dream by night. God said, "Ask, what shall I give you?" And Solomon said, "You have shown great mercy to your servant David my father, because he walked before you in truth and righteousness and in uprightness of heart with you. You have continued this great kindness for him, and you have given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours?" So this is a very admirable request, right? And I like the way that Solomon conducts himself. This is a great example for all of us. He confesses a very deep sense of responsibility to God. He's got to carry on in his father's ways. His father was a great king. And, you know, while we spent a lot of time talking about David's poorest moment as king, it's good for us to remember that none of us are measured by our worst days in God's eyes. That God is a forgiving God, and because of David's contrition, God forgave him. So even though that was a terrible episode with Bathsheba, on the whole, David had a pretty good reign. He had helped Israel to be secure from its enemies and had helped establish the kingdom in ways that Saul had not. Solomon not only wants to continue on in his father's footsteps, but he also wants to administer justly. He wants to be a just king. So this is a very admirable request. He asks for an understanding heart, that I may discern between good and evil. And God compliments him. He could have asked for wisdom. He could have asked for a lot of other things other than wisdom. He could have asked for long life. He could have asked for riches. He could have asked for victory over his servants. But Solomon instead asks for wisdom. And if you read there in verse number 11, notice verse number 11. 5 times in the Hebrew, the word ask is stated by God. You asked for this. Ask, ask, ask. So God is acknowledging that this is a great request. That Solomon could have asked for this, or could have asked for that, or could have asked for that, but instead he asks for wisdom. So this pleases God, and it pleases God so much that not only is he going to give Solomon wisdom, he's going to give him everything else he could have asked for. Behold, I have done according to your word. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. And I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days. So if you walk in my ways to keep my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. All right, so not only is Solomon given wisdom, but he's given all the things that he could have asked for. But there's a bit of an if in this, right? God's promise is contingent upon following the righteous example of David. So if Solomon really wants to be a wise and good king, the best thing for him to do is to follow the commands of God. Do not turn to the right or to the left. And as I was thinking about Solomon's request, it got me to thinking about some of the things that Solomon says about wisdom in the book of Proverbs. Here's one. This is from chapter 4, starting in verse 3. When I was my father's son, so Solomon here is talking about his father David. When I was my father's son, tender and the only one in the sight of my mother, he also taught me and said to me, let your heart retain my words. Keep my commands and live. That kind of sounds familiar, right? What has God just told Solomon? Walk in the ways of your father David. Keep my commands. So David was telling Solomon the same thing from a very young age. He says, get wisdom, get understanding. Do not forget, nor turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her, and she will preserve you. Love her, and she will keep you. Wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore get wisdom. And in all you're getting, get understanding. Exalt her, and she will promote you. She will bring you honor when you embrace her. She will place on your head an ornament of grace. A crown of glory she will deliver to you. Hear, my son, and receive my sayings, and the years of your life will be many. I have taught you in the way of wisdom. I have led you in right paths. Now, isn't this interesting? When Solomon is asked by God, what can I give you? He asks for wisdom. And why do you suppose that? Because his father had been telling him since he was knee-high a grasshopper. I can't say it, I'm just going to go off. Since he was a short guy. Since he was young, he's been telling him, get wisdom, get wisdom, get wisdom. Wisdom is the principal thing. And in this quote from Proverbs, David exhorts his son to keep those commands. And that takes us back to God's promise. David emphasizes that wisdom from God should be pursued above all things. This is the greatest thing he felt his son could find. The one who receives wisdom from God, David says, will receive honor and will also receive longer life. So David had told Solomon, since he was a young man, if you get wisdom, this will bring you honor and length of life. So no wonder when God came to Solomon, Solomon says, I'd like to be wise. I would like to be wise. Here's a couple other quotes. Proverbs 3, verses 13 through 18. Happy is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who gains understanding, for her proceeds are better than the profits of silver, and her gain than fine gold. What did God say to Solomon? Because you've asked for wisdom, I will also make you wealthy. Solomon says, wisdom's better than wealth. I am wealthy, but I can say that wisdom is better. She is more precious than rubies, and all the things that you may desire cannot compare with her. Length of days is in her right hand. Notice that, length of days, promise again. Length of days is in her right hand, and in her left hand riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who take hold of her, and happy are all who retain her. Wealth, life, and peace come to those who walk in the way of wisdom. Again, this ties back to this exchange between Solomon and God. Here's the last one from Proverbs. This is Proverbs chapter 8. This is the chapter in which Solomon personifies wisdom. I, wisdom, dwell with prudence and find out knowledge and discretion. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride and arrogance and the evil way, and the perverse mouth I hate. Counsel is mine and sound wisdom. I am understanding. I have strength. By me kings reign and rulers decree justice. By me princes rule and nobles, all the judges of the earth. I love those who love me, and those who seek me diligently will find me. Riches and honor are with me, enduring riches and righteousness. My fruit is better than gold, yes, than fine gold, and my revenue than choice silver. I traverse the ways of righteousness in the midst of the paths of justice, that I may cause those who love me to inherit wealth, that I may fill their treasuries. So what are the benefits of wisdom? Well, those who fear God will hate evil and depart from it. Again, that kind of echoes what God told Solomon and what David, his father, told him as well. Depart from evil. Kings, princes, and judges rule by wisdom. Riches are far better than gold or with wisdom. And those with wisdom from God will live a rich, full life. So these are the conclusions that Solomon had reached after God had made him a wise man. He sees all the benefits of wisdom, and he celebrates it all throughout the book of Proverbs. So I just thought those three quotations were interesting because they all kind of tie back to the things that God was saying to Solomon when he praised him for his good request. So Solomon wakes up from this dream in which he's had this vision of God, and he figures out, yep, it had been a dream. He decides, he leaves Gibeon, he goes back to Jerusalem, and he stands before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. Remember, the Ark of the Covenant is in a tent where David had placed it many years before this. He came to Jerusalem, stood before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, offered up burnt offerings, offered peace offerings, and made his feast for all his servants. All right, so here we've got the Ark of the Covenant between the cherubim. This is where God dwells. So Solomon's received this communication from God over at Gibeon. He goes back to Jerusalem, and he praises and worships God for answering his request. Just one little verse I want to tag in here. James chapter 1, verse number 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. Be like Solomon, in other words, right? If you want wisdom, just ask for it. And if you keep reading, when you ask in faith without doubting, God will give it to you. He will make you wise. One of the things I really appreciate about this promise is God gives it liberally, or in other words, he gives it abundantly. Like if someone asks him for wisdom, he gives them as much as they can take, if you will. And he also gives it without reproach. He doesn't look down on us and say, well, there's dummy old Wade. He's asking for wisdom again. I can't believe this idiot's asking for wisdom. He doesn't look down on us like that. He sees this as, in my estimation, it's an act of humility. it's me saying to God, I don't know everything. I make mistakes. I need your help so that I can make the right choices. So God honors this. He bestows wisdom liberally, and he doesn't look down on us for asking for wisdom. And if we ask in faith, we can be sure that we will receive it. Now, I've got 5 more slides, but we don't have to get to those. They're just kind of the icing on the cake for tonight. So I'd be happy to entertain any questions or comments as we start to wrap this up. Anybody got anything they want to say this evening? I decided not to talk about dividing the baby. I figured that story was probably pretty familiar with you all, and instead I thought it would be good just to spend some time kind of setting the stage for building the temple, where we're at in the arc of the story, what we're working toward, and then just talking about wisdom a little bit this evening. Questions, comments? You guys got anything you want to add? No? All right, so we'll just do just a quick little review of where we're at, big picture here. So the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy, Joshua through Esther, Psalms, the Song of Solomon, Isaiah through Daniel, Hosea through Malachi. Each one of these can be divided up into various categories. You have the law, you have the books of history, you've got the books of poetry, you have the major prophets and the minor prophets, right? Those are sort of the divisions of the Old Testament. So we're smack dab right here in the middle of the books of history. That's where we're at right now. Remember, all this began back with the flood, this timeline. 465 years after the flood, God makes his promise to Abraham. 430 years after the promise to Abraham, we have the Exodus. 480 years after the Exodus is when the temple is built by Solomon. And then there's another 430 years until the building of the second temple. And then between the building of the second temple and the birth of Jesus is about 530 years. So where are we? We're right smack dab in the middle of this section, right? We're between the Exodus and the building of the temple. Actually, we're kind of at the end of this section, right? So we've talked about the era of the judges, Moses through Samuel. We're now at the tail end of what's called the unified kingdom. Because remember, after Solomon's reign, the kingdom divides in two. And things get a little bit, crazy in that time period. So we've talked about Saul, we've talked about David, we've talked about Solomon. And in this area, at least as far as the books are concerned, we've gone through Joshua just a little bit. We've gone through Judges and Ruth, right? 1 Samuel talks to us about Samuel and Saul. 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles talks to us about David. And right now, we're in the end of the unified kingdom. We're in the first part of 1 Chronicles and the first part of 1 Kings and the first part of 2 Chronicles. There we go. That's what I was trying to say. So that's kind of where we're at, big picture. We're at the tail end of this time period, and once Solomon's reign is over, the kingdom will divide, and as I mentioned a moment ago, things get really interesting. So that's our roadmap, and that's where we've been. Anybody got anything they want to say? I thought there was a hand there for a second, Tammy.
Well, good job.
Oh,
I was gonna say.
that was a thumbs up.
That was a really good way to help us see where we are now. That was good. Good summary. Thank you.
These sorts of things really help me a lot because I kind of need structure in order to see how everything fits together. That's just the way my brain works, and since that's the way my brain works, you're stuck with it. So, yeah. Anything. Great to see you all tonight. That wind is really blowing. I don't know if you all can hear it, but it's right at my back. So everybody be safe going home. Watch for those deer. And Lord willing, I won't see you all on Sunday, but hope you all can make it back on Sunday morning. So if there's anyone here who needs to get back on the right track, if we can help anyone find their way back to Jesus. If you're struggling with things and you need the prayers of the saints here, we invite you to let us know how we can help. Or if you're listening online and you don't know anything about the Lord or about His church and you want to know more information, drop us a message on Facebook, send us something on our YouTube channel, email us, whatever way we can help you. Just reach out to us. We'd love to help you know more about Jesus and His plan for your salvation. Let us know how we can help as we stand and sing.
Sing verses 1 and 4. 1 and 4. All things are ready. Come to the feast. Come, for the table now is spread. Ye famishing, ye weary, come, and thou shalt be richly fed. Hear the invitation. Come,
Hear the invitation, whosoever will.
praise
God
for salvation, for whosoever will. All things are ready. Come to the feast. Leave every care and worldly strife. Come feast upon the love of God and drink everlasting life. Invitation, come whosoever will. Praise God, for whosoever will. So let's see everyone out this evening.